With all the fuzz surrounding the new Warframe update, I almost forgot that the anniversary event is still going on, and that means more free stuff for all of us. In fact, later today, we will get our hands on the Dex Dakra, and I gotta say, this thing positively surprised me. So, in today's Warframe guide, we're gonna take a look at the Dex Dakra, how they work, what to keep in mind when building them, and I have multiple Steel Path builds prepared for you, as well as a beginner-friendly one too, for all the new attenders out there who sniped this weapon from the event and would like to know if it is of any use to them. Spoiler, it probably will be. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now, well, let's jump right into it. First things first, let's quickly go over again how you can get the Dex Dakra for yourself, just so you don't miss it. Right now in Warframe there is an anniversary event going on. That means there are multiple missions, and as a reward for playing them, you will get different things, among them of course the Dex Dakra. In order to find these missions, just head over to your star chart, click up here, and then you will see them in the drop-down menu. Just note that this video clip in the background here is pre-recorded, that's why you don't see the Dex Dakra itself here, but once this thing goes live later today, you will find the Dex Dakra exactly here. Now, I'm sure most of you know this, but I still want to mention it again. Even if you already own a copy of the Dex Dakra, then still go ahead and play this event anyway, because that means you get a second copy of the Dex Dakra, and all the anniversary event weapons come with their own inventory slot, which means that you can just sell off duplicates and effectively get one free inventory slot. This is very nice, specifically given that we have the Coda weapons, the infested lich weapons with the update last week, and that means you probably have a good use for a bigger inventory. But now that you know how to get it for yourself, let's talk a bit about what this thing actually is and how it works. Starting out with the basics, the Dex Dakra are considered dual swords, which means they are part of a big group of melee weapons. By the way, I find myself talking about dual swords relatively often recently, that's kinda surprising. But as dual swords, that obviously means it has access to all the dual sword stances, and since it is one of the anniversary weapons, you can only get it from this anniversary event, and then it will be unavailable for the entire year, and it comes pre-installed with an Orokin catalyst, meaning a double the mod capacity, which is especially nice for earlier game players where you don't have access to that many Orokin catalysts just yet. Now, finding the right stance mod here is relatively simple because you just go with Swirling Tiger since it matches the pre-installed polarity slot, and in general, Swirling Tiger is usually the preferred stance on dual swords anyway, so you're fine. Let's now also take a look at the weapon stats themselves, and at first glance this doesn't look all too omega impressive, right? We have 16% crit chance with a 2x multiplier, that is definitely below average, but the status chance of 24% is at least pretty good. However, the base damage of 142 is just average, and that doesn't get better when looking at the attack speed, which is below 1 and therefore more on the slower side of things. All in all, this really doesn't sound all too impressive, right? But we gotta keep in mind that this is still a free weapon that is being gifted to all of us with a pre-installed catalyst, and especially for newer or early mid-game players out there, it can be very beneficial to have it, and as you're gonna see in a second here, even if you are in Steel Path, these things perform really nicely with the right build. So how about, after giving the video a quick like to help me with the YouTube algorithm, cheers so much for your support, let's talk about builds next. Alright, first of all, let's talk about the beginner build. This right here is a pretty simple setup with easy to acquire mods. For the elemental combination, I went corrosive against Grenier, but of course, if you were going up against any other types of enemies, you would have to adjust a little bit here, but I think that is relatively obvious. Just one thing I really want to mention with this is that due to the low base crit chance, the Dex Dakra really wants to use Blood Rush, which I know is not necessarily a beginner-friendly mod, takes quite a bit of farming, but if you are a beginner and you got the Dex Dakra, you want to use it and potentially upgrade it over time, then the first thing you're definitely looking at would be Blood Rush, because without it, it's just going to be really difficult to consistently crit with the Dex Dakra, and once you replace True Steel with Blood Rush, you will see a massive improvement in performance. And then another thing, since this is mostly a light attack combo build, if you have already finished the second dream quest and therefore access to your operator, then make sure to go for the Naramon focus tool in order to keep up your combo. Otherwise, those more light attack focused builds tend to be a bit more on the painful side. But okay, so much for the beginner part of the video. Let's now take this thing into Steel Path, and here the first thing I want to discuss would be arcanes, because there are actually quite some viable options here, so let's go over them one by one first. Since the Dex Dakra has a relatively low crit chance of just 16% at base, that makes it a perfect candidate for melee duplicate. Melee duplicate applies to only yellow crits and makes yellow crits hit twice, and if I'm not mistaken, then with Blood Rush as well as Galvanized Steel, we should end up at a total of 102-ish% crit chance, which would make this weapon perfect for melee duplicate, so if you have it, you can definitely use it. Up next, of course, we have to talk about the most busted arcane since sliced bread, melee influence, and I don't know what you expect me to say. Of course, it is broken, it is strong, it's probably the best option, like on any other melee weapon in the game. So yeah, if you want to mod electricity on it, use melee influence, you're gonna be happy. One more thing that I want to mention is melee vortex, which in general is a relatively good arcane, but especially on the Dex Dakra, I'm not that much of a fan of it, and the reason for that would be the follow-through stat. See, in Warframe, when you hit multiple enemies with one strike of a melee weapon, then only the first enemy that the melee touches will take the full damage, and every subsequent enemy will only take a fraction of the damage that the enemy before them have taken. This damage reduction per enemy hit is called follow-through, you can see it in the stats right here, and for the Dex Dakra we're only at 50%, which is pretty darn low, so something like Melee Vortex, which groups up a bunch of enemies in one spot, is essentially not all that strong here, because hitting a bunch of enemies will just mean that most of them will take essentially no damage. In my opinion, if you want to go for Melee Vortex, then search for weapons that are specifically relatively close to 100% follow-through, because that is a really strong combination. But I think we should also talk about Tennokai, where, just like with most melees, I say use whichever Tennokai mod you want, but if you were to go for a Tennokai setup, then I always prefer melee animosity, scaling up your critical chance for the eventual Tennokai attack so that it is even more devastating. And finally, if you want to go up against Grineer, Skuldra, or any other type of enemy that is weak to corrosive, then melee exposure 2 might be worth considering for that big corrosive damage boost, you know, amping up your numbers a little bit. But yes, that would be my thoughts on the arcane situation. Let's now take a look at the builds, where the first thing I want to talk about is the melee duplicate build. This right here would be the one, mostly focused on light attacks and dealing slashes because the slash portion of her damage is relatively high, and the Swirling Tiger stance already deals quite a lot of force proc slashes. This right here then would be my melee influence build, where I personally just went for electricity, so that's the only element that will be spread here. If you have other preferences, then you might have to mix and match a bit more with this build, maybe throw out Berserker Fury and get your attack speed from a Warframe arcane like Arcane Strike or something, and therefore use this mod slot for another element. So specifically with this melee influence build, don't treat this as a definite must-be, more as a suggestion. And then I also tried to build for heavy attacks, but I gotta say I'm not the biggest fan here, because unlike many other melee weapons, dual swords don't force proc slash on heavy attacks, meaning especially against thick armor targets, this is likely not gonna get you anywhere. And now that we discussed the builds, there is one last topic on today's list, and that would be Riven mods, because for the Dex Dakra it's a relatively interesting situation. While we do have the Dakra Prime in the game as weapon, we don't have a regular dual Dakra type of weapon, so the Dex Dakra is actually in a category of its own. If you have a Dakra Riven, that will work on your Prime, but it will not work on your Dex Dakra. For the Dex Dakra, you need a specific Dex Dakra Riven, but just in case you were to have one, then you can be happy because the Riven disposition is absolutely brutal. It's very high, so you're gonna see big numbers. And here, I would recommend you just go with the standard stuff. More crit chance, more crit damage, more base damage, or, especially if you want to go for melee influence, look for a Riven that has innate electricity on it, because that means you essentially save up on one mod slot in which you would usually put the electricity in. But how about that? In case some of you already own a Dex Dakra ribbon, then feel free to post the stats on it in the comments down below to make all of us jealous. The Dex Dakra is really decent, but if you want to see my favorite dual swords in the entirety of Warframe right now, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycan Shepherd, Anakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.